The scrape of a chair against polished marble cut through the anniversary waltz, like a slap no one saw coming. My father rose slowly, the way he always did when he wanted the room to feel his presence before his words did. He lifted his champagne flute, the good crystal, the set my mother had been saving since their wedding, and he smiled at the table full of people who loved him and trusted that smile completely. 30 years of marriage, he said. 30 years of building something worth celebrating. Everyone raised their glasses. I raised mine too, because that's what I did. I showed up. I smiled. I played my part. Then he looked directly at me. And this year, he said, his voice dropping just enough to feel intimate, to feel like a kindness. Claire's going to step up and help your brother get back on his feet. She's in a strong place financially. Jake needs the support right now. It's just family taking care of family. The table murmured warmly. My aunt nodded. My uncle tipped his glass in my direction like I'd already agreed, like I'd already signed something. My mother didn't look at me at all. Jake sat 2 seats down, turning his water glass in slow circles on the tablecloth, eyes fixed somewhere near the centerpiece. I set my champagne down without drinking it. My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 29 years old. I've worked in corporate finance since I was 22, and I've spent the last 7 years being the person in my family who answered every call, wired every transfer, and never once said the word no without immediately apologizing for it. I thought I was being a good daughter, a good sister. It took my father raising a glass of champagne in a room full of people to make me understand exactly what I had actually been. I was a policy, not a person. A financial instrument they had decided, somewhere along the way, would never expire. The dinner continued around me. Compliments to the chef. A toast to 30 more years. My aunt told the story of how my parents met, the one she always told at family events, and everyone laughed in the same places they always laughed. I cut my salmon into smaller and smaller pieces and thought about the number in my savings account and what my father had just announced it was for. Jake had been getting back on his feet for 4 years. He dropped out of his university program halfway through junior year, which my parents called a pivot. He moved back home, which they called a reset. He took a job at a landscaping company, quit after 6 weeks, then spent 3 months telling everyone he was developing a fitness app. The app was never developed. What was developed was a car payment he couldn't meet on a part-time bartending salary and an apartment lease he'd co-signed with a friend who stopped paying rent in February. Every time I asked how he was doing, my mother said he was finding himself. I had found myself at 22 in a studio apartment with a second-hand desk and a grocery budget of $60 a week. No one called that finding myself. They called it living within my means. But Jake was different. Jake had potential. Jake just needed more time, more runway, more patience from everyone around him, and apparently more of my money. On the drive home that night, my phone buzzed twice before I'd even pulled out of the restaurant parking lot. My mother first. Honey, your dad just wants what's best for both of you. Jake is really struggling. Then my father. We'll talk details this week. Don't overthink it. Don't overthink it. I sat in my car with the engine running and both texts on my screen, and I thought about the transfer I'd made in March, $1,200 for Jake's overdue car insurance. Because he said he'd lose his license if it lapsed and he needed his car for work. I thought about the money I'd sent in October, $800 to cover 2 months of his share of the apartment utilities because his roommate had moved out and the bills were still in both their names. I thought about the $1,500 I'd sent the previous Christmas because my mother had called me crying, saying Jake was too proud to ask, but he hadn't eaten a real meal in 4 days. I thought about the fact that I had never been repaid a single dollar of any of it. And then I thought about something else, something that had been sitting in the back of my mind for weeks, quiet and uncomfortable, like a stone in a shoe I'd been too busy to stop and remove. 3 months ago, Jake had asked me to co-sign his new apartment lease. His landlord wanted a guarantor with verifiable income, and his friend who was supposed to co-sign had backed out. It would be no risk, he said. He'd never miss a payment. It was just a formality, just a name on a document. Just family helping family. I had said I needed to think about it. He had sent me the documents digitally. I had opened them, started reading, gotten distracted by a work deadline, and told myself I'd look again over the weekend. I never signed them. Or at least, I hadn't thought I had. The next morning I woke up early, made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop. I wasn't angry. I was something colder than angry, something that felt more like clarity arriving after a long delay. I opened my email and found the thread with Jake's lease documents. I read every page this time. Slowly, all the way through. My name was on page 4. Electronic signature. Date of signing, 2 weeks before the anniversary dinner. I had not signed those documents. I sat with that information for a long time. The coffee went cold. The morning light moved across my kitchen table, and I didn't move with it. I read the page again. My name, in the signature field, on a date when I had been in Denver for a work conference and hadn't opened my personal email once. Someone had signed my name. The only person who had access to the document link was Jake. I closed the laptop very gently. I stood up, rinsed my coffee mug, dried my hands on the kitchen towel, and stood at my window looking out at the street below. A woman was walking her dog. A teenager was waiting for a bus. Everything outside looked completely ordinary. Inside me, something that had been bending for years finally straightened. I didn't call Jake. I didn't call my parents. I went to work. I did my job. I came home, and that evening I called a lawyer. Not to threaten anyone. Not yet. I called to understand exactly what my name on that lease meant, what my exposure was, and what my options were. The lawyer was calm and thorough, and she explained everything without judgment. By the time we hung up an hour later, I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. My name on that lease made me financially liable for the entire remaining term if Jake defaulted. Given Jake's history, this was not a hypothetical risk. It was an unfolding reality with a timeline I could now see clearly. I also understood that an electronic signature obtained without consent was fraud, full stop. I thanked her and asked her to send me a list of next steps. Then I opened my kitchen drawer, took out the folder where I kept important documents, and began building a timeline. Every text where my mother asked me to send money, every email confirmation of a bank transfer, every time I'd been told it was temporary, just this once, just until he gets stable. I had kept all of it, not strategically, just because deleting financial records felt careless. Now it was something else. It was documentation. My father called on Wednesday. His voice was cheerful, business as usual. The tone he used when he had already decided the outcome of a conversation. Jake's car payments are 3 months behind, he told me. The dealership is threatening repossession. If we can get that cleared up now, he can refinance at a lower rate and take it from there. I asked how much. $3,200, he said. To catch up plus fees. I said I needed a few days to think. He said, of course. Take your time. But sooner is better than later. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a moment and let myself feel the full weight of what was being asked. $3,200 to keep my brother's car out of repossession, on top of everything else, on top of a lease I had never agreed to but whose paperwork said otherwise. I thought about the anniversary dinner. The way he had announced it. The way the table had nodded. The way it had been presented not as a request but as an update, a thing already decided, something I would accommodate because I always had. I thought about my mother's text, don't overthink it. I thought. What they mean when they say don't overthink it is don't think at all. I wrote down the $3,200 in my notebook. I added it to the column that already existed. The total, after 7 years, was not small. The following Saturday, my mother appeared at my door without calling first. She was still in her good coat, like she'd come straight from somewhere, her purse held tight against her side. Her expression set in that particular shape. I'd been reading my whole life, the one that meant she was about to say something she'd already decided was reasonable. I let her in. I made tea. I sat across from her at my kitchen table and waited. She said she was worried about me. She said I seemed distant lately, closed off, that she could tell something was wrong, and she just wanted to understand. Then she took a breath and said that Jake wasn't sleeping, that he was genuinely scared this time, that this wasn't like before, that the pressure he was under was different now, real now, and that he needed to know his family had his back. I asked her what she thought family meant. She looked at me like the question was strange. I told her I had been sending money to this family for 7 years. That I had never once been asked if I could afford it, never once had anyone check whether I was scared or struggling or sleeping. That the phone calls came to me and the transfers went out from me, and what came back was silence until the next time something needed to be paid. She said, "You make a good salary, Claire. You've always been the responsible one." And there it was. The sentence that had shaped my entire role in this family, without anyone ever examining it. The responsible one. Responsible for what, exactly? For whom? Under whose authority and toward whose benefit? I told her calmly that being responsible had never meant being a bank account without a limit. I told her about the lease documents. I watched her face change. She said she was sure it was just a misunderstanding. She said Jake probably thought I'd agreed in principle, that he might not have realized. She said, "You know how he is. He doesn't always think things through," which was the most honest thing she had said in years, and somehow also the saddest. I said I knew exactly how he was. That was the problem. She left without finishing her tea. At the door she turned and said I was making this harder than it needed to be. I said I disagreed. She left. I stood at my window and watched her car pull away from the curb, and I noticed I wasn't shaking. My hands were steady. I had expected to feel guilty, and I did not. What I felt was something quiet and very clear, like a room after the furniture has been rearranged and suddenly you can see how much space there actually is. Jake called that evening. His voice had the particular flatness of someone performing a kind of exhaustion, a tone designed to generate sympathy before a sentence is finished. He said he guessed I was upset. I said I wasn't upset. I said I was asking him directly whether he had signed my name on his lease documents without my knowledge or permission. Long pause. He said it wasn't like that. He said he had been desperate, that the landlord had a deadline, that he thought I'd said yes when we talked about it before, and he just thought he was following through on what I'd already agreed to. I said I had never agreed. He said it was a misunderstanding. He said I was punishing him for a mistake. I said I was not punishing him. I said I was protecting myself, which was something I should have started doing years earlier. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "So you're just not going to help me?" And I thought about that sentence. The shape of it, the assumption buried inside it, the idea that my not doing something was an action I was taking against him, rather than simply the end of something I had never been obligated to do in the first place. I told him I hoped he figured things out. I told him I genuinely did. And then I ended the call. The next morning, I sent 2 emails. The first was to the leasing company, formally disputing my signature on the co-signed documents and stating that I had not authorized the use of my information or signature and would be pursuing the matter further. I CC'd my lawyer. The second was to my bank, requesting that my accounts be flagged for any unusual activity and asking them to confirm no secondary cards, no linked accounts, and no authorized users I hadn't personally added. I had a feeling, just a feeling, and I wanted to be certain. The bank called me back within 48 hours. The feeling had been right. 6 months ago, a credit card had been opened in my name at a secondary bank, using my social security number, my address, and a slight variation of my email. The billing had been going to an address I didn't recognize. The balance on the card was $4,700. I sat very still for a moment after hearing that number. Then I thanked the representative, asked them to walk me through the fraud reporting process, and spent the next 2 hours on the phone. By the end of the afternoon, the card was frozen, a fraud report had been filed, and I had a reference number for a process that would take time but was already in motion. I forwarded everything to my lawyer. She responded within the hour. She said the forged lease signature, combined with the fraudulent credit card, opened a significant legal exposure for whoever had done this. She said I should be prepared for things to move quickly once the investigations began. She said I had done everything right. I thanked her and closed my laptop and cooked dinner and ate it at my table alone, and for the first time in as long as I could remember. Tough. I did not spend the meal thinking about what someone else needed from me. 3 days later, the calls started. My father first, his voice tight in the way it got when he was angry but trying not to show it. He asked what I had done. I said I had protected myself legally. He said I was blowing this out of proportion, that family didn't take family to court, That whatever Jake had done, he didn't mean it and I was making it into something it wasn't. I said I hadn't filed anything yet. I had only reported fraud to a bank, which was both accurate and legally required. He said I was punishing everyone to make a point. I said I wasn't trying to make a point. I was trying to make sure my credit and my financial future weren't destroyed by someone who had already decided my resources belonged to him. He said, "That is not who your brother is." I said, "Dad, I have a credit card in my name with nearly $5,000 on it that I did not open." Silence. He said he was sure there was an explanation. I said I was sure there was too, and that the explanation was in progress. My mother texted 40 minutes after that call. The text was long. It covered grief, love, family, loyalty, everything I was throwing away. The image of Jake as a child, the time I was 9 and he was 6 and he'd followed me everywhere like a shadow. How could I do this to that little boy? Did that mean nothing to me? It was an extraordinarily skilled piece of emotional persuasion, and I could see exactly how it had worked on me for years. I put my phone face down on the counter and made myself a cup of tea. The following week, my father organized what he called a family check-in. He framed it as a chance to clear the air before things went further. I recognized the structure. I had watched it work on other people in my family, the gathering of numbers, the weight of the room, the feeling that you were one against many and many had already decided. I went anyway. I don't entirely know why. Some part of me still believed that if I was in the room, if they could see my face, something would shift in them. That the people who had loved me my whole life would remember that they loved me and that this would change something. My aunt and uncle were there, 2 cousins. My grandmother, who sat in the corner and said nothing but watched everything. My parents at the head of the table, and Jake beside my mother, eyes down, hands folded. My father opened by saying they were all concerned about the direction things had taken. That this had started as a family conversation and escalated beyond what any of them intended, and that they wanted to find a way forward together. I waited. He said that Jake had made some mistakes. That these mistakes came from a place of desperation, not malice. That the family believed in rehabilitation and second chances, and that pursuing legal action was a road no one in this room wanted to go down. I looked around the table. My aunt was nodding. My uncle was looking at his hands. My cousins had the strained, fixed expressions of people who had been told what the meeting was about before they arrived. My grandmother was watching me. I asked Jake directly, in front of everyone, whether he had opened a credit card in my name. The room went very still. My mother said, "We're not here to interrogate anyone." I said I was asking my brother a direct question, and I would like a direct answer. Jake looked up. His face did something complicated, a flicker of something real underneath the performance of remorse. Then he said he had made a mistake. He said the rent had been late and he'd panicked and he hadn't thought it through and he was sorry. The words sorry dropped into the room and no one moved. My aunt exhaled. My uncle looked at the ceiling. I said, "The credit card balance is $4,700. Before that, by my count, I've sent a total of over $14,000 to this family in the last 7 years." I said I had the records if anyone wanted to see them. My mother said, "Claire, that's not why we're here." I said, "I know why you're here. You're here because the thing you had arranged, the arrangement where I absorbed the consequences of decisions I didn't make, has been disrupted. And you want to negotiate it back into place before the legal process makes that impossible." No one spoke. I looked at my father. He was the one I had wanted to reach, maybe more than anyone. He was the one whose voice I had spent my entire life trying to make proud. He sat at the head of the table looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not love. Something more uncomfortable than either. He looked like a man looking at something he had done and not fully recognizing it. I said, "I'm not trying to destroy this family. I'm not trying to put anyone in prison. I'm trying to stop being held responsible for a life I didn't choose to live, using money I worked 7 years to earn, to soften consequences for someone who has never once faced them." My grandmother spoke for the first and only time. She said, "Let her finish." I said, "Jake opened a credit card in my name. That is fraud. I didn't report it to punish him. I reported it because if I hadn't, the debt would eventually have come to me, quietly, The way everything in this family comes to me quietly, and I would have been expected to handle it. I am choosing not to handle it. I pushed my chair back and picked up my bag. My father said, "So that's it?" I said it wasn't it. I said I loved all of them, which was true and complicated, and did not change what I was about to do. I said I hoped Jake would use this as a real turning point, because I genuinely believed he could if he was ever actually required to. I said I would keep the lawyer involved until the matter was resolved, and that I hoped they understood this wasn't personal. My mother said, "How can you say this isn't personal?" I said, "Because it stopped being personal when it started being a financial arrangement. That was their choice, not mine." I walked out into a gray November afternoon and drove home, and sat in my parking garage with my hands on the steering wheel until they stopped trembling. Not from fear. From something else. The particular physical exhaustion of finally doing the thing you've been postponing for years, the way your body catches up to your decision after the adrenaline fades. I felt emptied out and strangely light, the way you feel after you've been carrying something heavy for so long you stopped noticing the weight, and then you put it down, and your arms don't know what to do with themselves. In the weeks that followed, the silence from my family was total. No calls, no texts, no check-ins. After years of relentless contact, the sudden absence had a texture to it, almost physical. Some nights I sat with it and waited to feel the grief I thought I should feel. I kept waiting for the part where I broke down and decided the price was too high, that no amount of money was worth losing my family over. That I should call them and apologize and find a way to make it right. That part never came. What came instead was small, accumulating recognitions. I started sleeping through the night for the first time in years. I hadn't known I'd stopped until I started again. I realized I'd been waking at 2 or 3 in the morning, those half-conscious hours when anxiety surfaces without context, and lying there running calculations without naming what I was calculating. Whether there would be another call. Whether I'd have enough in savings if they needed something large. Whether I was being selfish by wanting to keep what I'd earned. The math had been running in the background constantly, and now it wasn't, and the silence where it had been felt enormous and clean. I called my grandmother. It felt important to call her, separate from the rest. She answered on the second ring. She sounded unsurprised to hear from me. She said she wanted me to know that she thought I had handled things with more grace than she would have managed at my age. I said I wasn't sure it was grace. I said it felt more like exhaustion reaching some kind of limit. She said sometimes that's what grace looks like from the inside. I asked if she thought the family would ever understand. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she thought some of them might, eventually, when enough time had passed. She said she thought my father was already understanding more than he was ready to say out loud. She said my mother would take longer, because she had built more of her identity around the story of the family, and revising that story was harder work for some people than others. She said she thought Jake might be the one who surprised me. I asked her what she meant. She said, "Some people need to see the net taken away before they learn to walk the wire." She said she hoped this was that moment for him. I said I hoped so too. I meant it. The legal process resolved over several months, quietly, without courtrooms. The credit card fraud report resulted in the debt being cleared from my credit file and investigated by the bank. I was not required to pay any of it. The lease dispute was settled when the leasing company voided my co-signature after reviewing the documentation and consulting their legal team. Jake was required to secure a new guarantor or vacate, which meant he had to actually deal with his housing situation rather than having me invisibly backstop it. My lawyer sent me a final summary email with the note, "You're clear." Well handled. I printed it out and put it in my folder. On the night of New Year's Eve, I stayed home alone. This was not a sad thing. I chose it deliberately and with pleasure. I cooked a real dinner, the kind I usually skipped because who makes a 3-course meal for one? And I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a reason that now felt right without being able to name exactly why. I stood at my window looking out at the city as midnight approached. The street below was full of people heading somewhere warm and lit up. The sky above the buildings was low and faintly orange from the city light, and somewhere a few blocks away I could hear music starting. I thought about the anniversary dinner. The scrape of my father's chair. The way he'd raised his glass like a man announcing a policy, not a person. The way I had set my champagne down without drinking it. I thought about all the years before that dinner, all the calls I had answered and transfers I had made and apologies I had swallowed because I loved my family and I thought that was what love required. I thought about the 7-year version of me, 22 and new to everything, who had started saying yes because it was easier and had never found a way to stop. I thought about my grandmother's voice on the phone. Sometimes that's what grace looks like from the inside. I raised my glass to the window, not in triumph. I want to be clear about that. There was no satisfaction in any of this. Not really. Not the way people sometimes imagine when they picture cutting contact or setting boundaries. What there was something quieter and harder to name. The feeling of having finally told the truth about yourself and survived it. The feeling of a life that had been arranged around other people's comfort being gently, firmly rearranged around your own. To clarity, I said quietly. To the city, to the orange sky. To whatever version of the next year was waiting on the other side of midnight. And then I drank my wine, alone and warm and completely at peace, and I let the new year come.